Good morning and welcome back to the reading of God's Word. Of course, this week we are in the book of Jeremiah, and we are now midweek in this study. And we are in Jeremiah chapters 29 through 36 as far as this video is concerned. And I want to start off and tell you, please stay dedicated with this reading. Right now we are very busy. There's a lot happening in these passages, and it is leading right up to now the fall of Jerusalem, and there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of prophecy. There are a lot of people and personalities like we talked about in the last video. Too many to discuss. Just pay attention mostly to the kings that are involved, because they're the ones that are the decision makers, and by that they were the ones that caused God to go ahead and bring about his judgment on Jerusalem. And we could go back and talk about the kings all the way from Rehoboam and Jeroboam after Solomon and how this thing got to where it is now. But I would refer you back to the book of Kings, both Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and it gives you an idea of the flow of the kings. And primarily nothing ever gets any, there's a few good kings, but primarily nothing ever gets any better, and it's leading up to where we are today. So stay dedicated in this reading, and because we're in the most profound event right now coming up. This exile of Jerusalem is the most profound event for Jerusalem, for Israel, that will ever take place up until probably after the tribulation that is yet to happen and the millennial reign, where they are completely restored. There will be a restoration for them partially, but it will take now all the way from 589, when Jerusalem fell. It will go all the way to 1948 before they would ever get their statehood back again. All of those years, 2,537 years, Jerusalem was under occupation of some force somewhere. And so you have to go back throughout all the history to read this, but this event that we're about to read about in this next video, before we get out of the book of Jeremiah, which is a first-hand account of the fall. So this is coming. This is promised. We're looking for eventually the millennial reign out of this, but that's way off into the future here. So we pick up today in chapter 29, and then right away Jeremiah is trying his best now to encourage those who have already been exiled, and he's telling them to go ahead, like we were saying in the last video, build houses, plant gardens, have a family, do the best you can to try to live in peace where you are until the time that God gets through with this 70 years that he has pronounced already. Remember, we just talked about that in the last video. When those 70 years up, he's going to be bringing them back. Again, you would have to go back to the book of Ezra and even Nehemiah to get into that restoration. But that would be in the future. That would be in the future here. But actually, we've already read that after the books of Kings. So you might go back and review that. But anyway, he's telling them that 70 years would be completed before all of them would come back. In chapter 29, verse 11, this is one of those famous, well-known verses. And God says, I know the plans I have for you. And we know that you've heard that, you see that a lot. This is a prediction then of the future. God is making it basically a direct reference to the millennial reign. So that's the plans he has way off in the future somewhere. But he will go through a lot with bringing them back after the 70 years, but there's a lot to come. There is still the first advent of Christ before that millennial reign. So they've got that as much to look forward to as well. So that is a very known verse, and that verse can be used for countless numbers of sermons in it. Then we move on to chapter 30 and 31. Jeremiah prophesies of the hope of the restoration after the tribulation. We're just looking at this. So the tribulation now, of course, what we're seeing here is two this is one of those dual prophecies. It is the restoration at that 70-year mark. It's also a full restoration then way out past the tribulation period and into the millennial kingdom. So when you read that, when you read 30 and 31, pay attention to that so that you can kind of pick up on this dual prophecy of the full restoration during the reign of Christ after that. So very interesting, but look, pay close attention to it. Now in chapter 32, Jeremiah is told to buy a field, and this field is already being occupied by an enemy. So why in the world would you do that? Well, this is because they are being told, and Jeremiah is giving an example of, go ahead and make your plans to return. I am going to bring you back, God said. I will call you back from the nations from which you have been scattered. And so this is an illustration of that return to the land that they were promised that they were going to have. So Jeremiah buys this land and he secures the deed and has it recorded eventually. Now, Jeremiah would stay. Jeremiah would probably not ever have anything to do with that piece of land because he would wind up in Egypt down the road, but that's still ahead of us. Then in chapter 2, also look and read in verses 37 through 44 of the promised future of Israel. That full chapter is very, very busy with that promise that is yet to come. In chapter 33, verses 15 through 17, God reaffirms the Davidic covenant. Now, this Davidic covenant obviously has to do again with the millennial reign. This is that I will put, in those days, I will cause the righteous branch of David to spring forth. Obviously, he is a direct reference to Christ here. So a very powerful and positive chapter in the face of what is happening at this time right before the fall. He's giving promises that restoration is going to take place. There's a future. Remember, I know the plans I have for you. So all of this is prefaced or following that statement. In chapter 34 and verse 3, Jeremiah tells Zedekiah, basically, this is King Zedekiah, that he is not going to die. He said that he is going to survive, will not die by the sword. But when we go into the future here, as we read on, you're going to find out that Zedekiah probably wishes he would have died, because we're going to find out what his fate was. You'd have to fast forward up to chapter 39 and verses 6 and 7, and you will see what the fate of Zedekiah was going to be. But either way, it was not going to be good for him. We move on to chapter 35, and this is a little interesting in that Jeremiah tests the devotion of the Rechabites. The Rechabites are a nomadic tribe. They had this vow. They were told that they could not drink wine, and so Jeremiah offers them some wine. And this is the test of the Rechabites to give an example to Judah. If the Rechabites could keep their vows, keep their promise to their predecessors, why then couldn't Judah keep its vows and promises and the covenant of God with God instead of branching that way or falling away from that? So it's a sort of a look, and let me show you what this is all about. But they didn't again, Judah did not pay attention to it. So the Rechabites, they did stay true to their oath and never did take wine. And in chapter 36 here, as we close out the readings for this midweek, Jeremiah is told to write down all of the words of the prophecy that God had given him on a scroll. Now this scroll was scribed by Baruch, and who was one of the few people that Jeremiah could trust. But anyway, so he gets written down everything in the scroll, and he did this. Now the scroll was read 3 times. It was read one time in the temple, and the religious leaders read it. And then it was read before the princes. This would be the court of the king. And then it was read again before the king, and this would have been King Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim, when he read it, or when it was read to him, he would have nothing to do with it. So he took a knife and cut it up and put it in a fire and burned it. And this would cause him Oh, big, big problem. Jeremiah would write it again, and in verse 30, really, of chapter 36, God declares that Jehoiakim would have no one to sit on the throne of David. In other words, his lineage would stop right there. This would be the price that he paid. It was virtually a death sentence for his rebellion against God. So much is happening. So much is happening. Now stay tuned for this next video, because at this time we're going to run into the actual exile. We'll get up to the time Jerusalem falls in 589 and the events right in front of that. And then right behind that, there's just a few things there to pay attention to. So we're really busy right now. Again, I pray that you pray that as you read this, God gives you an understanding that this is, even though it's history of Jerusalem, it is also something left to come in the future. There's future prophecies involved in this as well, as we were looking at the millennial reign yet to come. And Israel will be brought back, and it will be made complete at that time. So a lot there, an awful lot that we need to pay attention to. So with that, I pray that God blesses the reading of his word.